Today, my guest and I discuss giant ape movies.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Today we continue to look at movies. My guest and I discuss giant ape movies. I met my guest at a convention called Archon, and he was giving a presentation on King Kong and giant ape movies, and I just thought that would be interesting to bring him on. I'd like just to apologize. The audio quality today is not very good, so I am very sorry about that. However, the interview is still a pretty good romp through some off-the-wall giant ape movies that are King Kong ripoffs. We also discuss King Kong a bit, as well as Mighty Joe Young, which is excellent. So I hope, even though the audio quality is not what I would like it to be, I do hope you enjoy today's show. My guest today is the editor of wearemoviegeeks.com, Tom Stockman. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I had wanted to talk about your top 10 giant ape movies because I am a movie geek as well. So why don't we just go ahead and jump right in? What are your top 10 giant ape movies?
Well, originally I was asked to write an article about my top 10 giant ape movies for Hoarder Hound magazine for the 80th anniversary of King Kong a few years ago. And I wrote that, and then they asked me to write the cover story on King Kong. So, of course, number one is the 1933 version of King Kong. Mm-hmm. It just kind of goes without saying.
Sure.
But there was this remake of King Kong in 1976. I don't like the remake of King Kong from 76. I like Peter Jackson's remake of King Kong, but the 1976 version has really nothing good in it. It has a decent score. And Jessica Lange looks super sexy in it, but besides that, it's really lousy. But that doesn't even make my top 10 giant ape movies. But that was a big hit. I mean, King Kong in 1933 was an enormous hit, of course. Mm-hmm. But the King Kong from 1976, which got a lot of publicity and a lot of merchandising, it's really a more interesting movie to read about than it is to actually sit through. They built this giant 50-foot robot, and it was covered with yak hair or something, some kind of hair, and but they promoted it around this big giant robot. So when I went to see it at the theater, I was about 13 at the time. I was expecting Kong to be played by this robot, but he really wasn't. He was played by Rick Baker in a gorilla suit, and they only showed that robot for about 10 seconds, and it looks really terrible. But I do have some, I think I even showed it to you. I have some hair from that big robot.
Yeah.
But it was such a success internationally that there was a bunch of really goofy and weird and esoteric and off-the-wall giant ape movies that came out around then. Like there was one from Korea it was just called Ape, but it was A-P-E. It was spelled out like it was some sort of anagram. And that's a pretty terrible one, but it's still more entertaining in its own way than the Dino De Laurentiis Kong. That's the one. It was actually filmed in 3D, and King Kong fights this. Oh, he fights a giant shark in one scene, and he flips off the camera, and it's really kind of pathetic. And you can even this costume, the ape suit is so cheesy you can actually see the stuntman's high top tennis shoes in a couple of shots. And then there's this stock destruction footage that they keep repeating. They keep showing the same scene over and over again. It's just really bizarre. But it's one of the most dismal, but it's unintentionally funny. It's out on Blu-ray on the Kino Lorber label, I think, of all things. And I think it's even in 3D, but I don't have a 3D television. I would have watched it in 3D now. But that one's called Ape.
Okay.
So I would put that in my top 10, pretty near the bottom, probably number 10 or 11. Now, like I say, the 1976 King Kong was a big hit. And that was produced by Dino De Laurentiis.
Mm-hmm.
And I said that, like I said, they merchandised the heck out of that thing. I have a King Kong raincoat and a King Kong belt. And, of course, a King Kong lunchbox and board games. And they just made everything on merchandise. And I have a King Kong kite. So it's kind of a fun... The artwork was really cool because they showed King Kong straddling the World Trade Center. I'm talking about this 76 version again. I keep going back to that because that's the one that inspired so many of these goofy ones that ended up on my top 10 list, even though it didn't. But they made a direct sequel. At the end of that one, Kong is shot. Have you ever seen it, Matt?
Yes, I've seen the 76 one. I think I saw Ape when I was a kid, but I'm not 100% sure. I watched some clips in preparation for the interview, and I think I had seen the whole thing of Ape when I was a kid, but I've seen the 76 version a long time ago. So now, I guess just for a little clarity, so Ape is like an honorable mention to your top 10?
Yeah, there's probably a good 10 or 11 better than
okay.
This. When I wrote this list and that I put on my site WeAreMovieGeeks.com, Kong Skull Island had not been released yet, or I had not seen it.
Okay.
So that's I think that's actually a fantastic movie.
Okay.
So that would be pretty near. That would probably be in my top 5 giant ape movies, and then the new Godzilla versus Kong, I think they're calling it. It's supposed to come out next year sometime. So that'll be a direct sequel to both Godzilla King of the Monsters and Kong Skull Island. Oh, wow. So I'm really looking forward to that because Kong Skull Island was so good. But the 76 one was a hit, but it took Dino Laurentiis another decade to make a sequel, and he did in 1986. It was called King Kong Lives. Mm-hmm. And it's much better. It's cheesier and it's less serious. But it was fast paced and really a lot of fun. Kong falls off the World Trade Center in 1976. So they replace his heart. The Jarvik heart was in the news a lot. And that was this artificial heart that some guy made. And so they actually put this medical device called this Jarvik heart. They even call it the Jarvik heart. Oh, yeah. They put it in, they make a giant one and they put it in King Kong. So all of a sudden King Kong has come back to life because he has this artificial heart. And then then they transport him back to Skull Island and he falls in love with Lady Kong and then the Marines go after him. And it's pretty good. It's really a lot of fun. Linda Hamilton from Terminator is in it.
Yeah.
And I'm actually seeing the new Terminator tomorrow night, so we'll see how that is. So that's King Kong Lives. I have that in my top 10, probably somewhere near the bottom. One of the funniest ones that was yet another knockoff of the Dino De Laurentiis film was Queen Kong. Mm-hmm. Queen Kong was made in 76 and came out right after the King Kong film, and Dino De Laurentiis sued the British studio that made Queen Kong. And so it was a really, really hard movie to find for a long time. I don't know if it ever played in the United States or not, and theatrically. I had just read about it and seen pictures of it, but it's sort of a gender-switching British variation. It stars there was this guy named Robin Asquith, who was a shaggy-haired guy who starred in all these British sex movies back in the 70s. And he plays this hippie named Ray Fay. Yeah. I'm a big fan of the Hammer horror films. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of my favorite Hammer starlets. Blood from the Mummy's Tomb is one of my favorites. And that busty brunette named Valerie Leon shows up in a red bikini in Queen Kong. And also Linda Hayden, who's probably my favorite Hammer blonde. You probably remember her from Blood on Satan's Claw and Taste the Blood of Dracula, and she was in Madhouse with Vincent Price. She was in a lot of stuff. So both of those women show up in Queen Kong. It's pretty silly. Queen Kong has breasts and a kind of a woman's hairdo. It follows the 1933 film pretty closely. There's a battle with a Tyrannosaurus Rex and a pterodactyl, and the special effects are pretty cheesy. But it's again, like the other two I was talking about. It's a lot of fun. It's much more fun than the '76 version that was inspired it. He climbs up Big Ben, which is the big clock there in the Tower of London. And he's wearing a giant bra and panties, or she is, I guess. And it's kind of a British. It's got a lot of British humor in it, and a couple of musical numbers, and it's something else. But it did come out on the Retro Media DVD label. Oh gosh, I don't know, 7 or 8, 9 years ago. So I had never seen it, and I really liked that one.
Yeah, I've never seen that either. I've just seen some clips on YouTube and that, but yeah.
It's pretty goofy.
Yeah, because I understand, yes, that he was De Laurentiis was successful in his lawsuit and got the release kind of stopped. So
yeah, which is too bad because it was cheap, but it cost some money. It's not that cheap. And they made all these miniature sets, and they got in some pretty decent actors and actresses in it. So that was too bad. Next on my list is Konga. Konga was not inspired by kids, but it was a bit earlier. It was from '62, I believe.
Yeah.
And I've always liked this movie. It's not that great, but it was one I saw when I was really little. And you know how when you're really little, and this was back when you didn't have your choice, before DVDs or even VHS. It was just when I saw when I was a kid, probably in the maybe the late or early '70s, probably on TV. So it's always had a soft spot in my heart. That stars Michael Gough. Michael Gough, you'll remember, was Alfred in the Michael Keaton Batman movies.
Yeah.
And he was also Jonathan Harker in Horror of Dracula with Peter Cushing. Very distinguished, who did a lot of horror stuff, Michael Gough. But he plays Dr. Decker, and he's a botanist. And he's discovered a serum that makes his pet chimpanzee grow out of control, and it goes smashing out of the glass ceiling of his greenhouse, and in one of my favorite scenes. It's got a shabby gorilla suit that was provided by an American named George Barris, and he designed gorilla suits. That was kind of one of his specialties. But it's the same gorilla suit that was used in Robot Monster, which is the one where he's wearing the helmet. He's got the gorilla suit on, but then he's got the helmet on with the antennas. The same suit, and George Barrows also used it for Gorilla at Large. But it's still that's another fun one.
Yeah. Now, I actually have a similar kind of memory of seeing Konga. It would have been in the kind of mid '80s or so for me, but I remember seeing it, and I was quite young, and I found it very enjoyable. The suit though, and like the mask are. Just looking at some clips, I mean they're terrible. But but I was going to say Michael Gough. He went after that role of Dr. Decker like he was just like, this is my only chance to play Hamlet or something. I mean, he just went after that role, and I mean he's something else. Yeah,
well, I guess he took everything seriously, and good for him.
Yeah.
Sure, he'd choose up the scenery, but I think he knew exactly what he was doing, and at least he didn't, phone it in.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
No. Another funny piece of trivia about that movie. Do you remember back in the '60s and '70s, up until about VHS era, every movie had a paperback tie-in novel?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's whole websites about and Facebook pages about the paperback tie-in. Well, Konga had a paperback tie-in, and I guess the guy who they hired to write it was bored, and he tried to see what he could get away with, so he wrote these like hardcore sex scenes and inserted them in the novel. And I guess who was ever proofreading them or paying them didn't notice, so the novel came out with all these weird sex scenes in it. and then they pulled it from the shelves. So that novelization has become quite the collector's item for that reason. And it had its own comic book series on the Charlton comic book label. It had its own comic book for a while, Kong.
Wow.
So I guess it must have been something of a hit, probably worldwide in 1962.
Huh. That's something.
Yeah,
else.
that's a good one. All right, moving on. Let's see. The next one on my list is King Kong Escapes. Now, that's one of the Toho Japanese movies, giant monster movies. And the first one was King Kong versus Godzilla, and that was a big hit in 1962. That was the first color Godzilla movie. And then about 5 years later, in 67, they brought back King Kong. And it really wasn't a sequel. There was a Rankin Bass animated TV series on Saturday morning called King Kong.
Mm-hmm.
And it was co-produced with a Japanese anime company this is way back in the mid 60s or 67.
Mm-hmm.
So this wasn't so much a sequel to King Kong versus Godzilla, but it was supposed to be like a live action tie into that animated Saturday morning TV series King Kong. So it's pretty fun. I mean, and that King Kong TV series was another thing that was merchandised a lot. There was board games and plush King Kong figures to tie into that Saturday morning show. I remember the Saturday morning show. I can remember the theme song and everything. But then they made this King Kong Escapes, and there's a Doctor Who was the villain, but he's no relation to the British time hopping Doctor Who. Kong battles a T-Rex and then a giant sea serpent. But then they built Mecha Kong. That's a robot version of Kong. Now, they had done that with Godzilla. They had built the Mecha Godzilla, which doesn't seem really practical to build a 100-foot tall robot, but they did. I mean, and it looks cool. It looks cooler than the one that Dino De Laurentiis built in 1976. But it's really a robot. I mean, he's silver and massive, and he's really cool looking, I think. I think the King Kong Escapes robot, Mecha Kong, is great. And it's kind of a kiddie movie. I mean, it's probably played at kiddie matinees and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, but that's a King Kong Escape. That's a lot of fun. So that's probably 7 or 8 on my list. Now we're moving down to the Mighty Peking Man, which was actually a Hong Kong entry into the King Kong bandwagon. It was also inspired by the De Laurentiis version. Like I said earlier, some of these most cheesy and most entertaining ones were just knockoffs of the 76 hit. It was produced by the Shaw Brothers, who produced a lot of the Kung Fu movies back in the 70s.
Yeah.
And I've shown a 16 millimeter print of this. I do a 16 millimeter show once a month at a night in St. Louis. And we've watched a 16 millimeter print. I've seen this movie many, many times. And it's pretty good. It's got a pretty good costume, but it's best remembered for this blonde Swedish actress named Evelyn Kraft is Samantha the Jungle Siren. And she's wearing the sexiest fur bikini you can imagine. I mean, I like the fur bikini Victoria Vetri wears in When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. And I also like the one that Raquel Welch wears in 1 Million Years BC. But this one that Evelyn Kraft wears in The Mighty Peking Man is really stunning. And if you watch it, especially when I watched it on the 16 millimeter print, you can watch her nipple pop out of the top half of her fur bikini quite a few times throughout the running of the film. Really sexy actress. I don't really know what else she was in, and I know she died quite a while ago too. So she didn't have much of a movie career, but you see her in all her nearly naked glory in her fur bikini in The Mighty Peking Man. So you seen that one, Matt?
Yeah, I have. I saw it when I was a kid, and then I just watched a few clips of it again in preparation for the interview, and yeah, it was pretty interesting. I think the weirdest thing for me is that there's no like shot continuity between like wide shots and then close-ups. There's just no continuity between them. It's just the kind of the bizarrest thing I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's a little inept, but still, it's a lot of fun. I like schlock and I like cheesy movies. I always have. So really, the schlockier the better, in my opinion. I just watch schlocky movies all the time.
Yeah.
All right, so that brings us to number 5 on this original list, and that's Son of Kong. Son of Kong. I mean, King Kong was such a big hit in 1933. The Son of Kong came out before the year was over.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's how quickly they produced Son of Kong. And it's only about an hour long. Robert Armstrong, who played Carl Denham, the explorer in King Kong, and comes back. Fay Wray does not come back, but Carl Denham returns to Skull Island because he's heard there is a secret hidden treasure there. So he has to pay off all the lawsuits that resulted from Kong's New York City rampage. Unfortunately, Willis O'Brien tore his King Kong armatures apart and reused a lot of them for Son of Kong, which is too bad because those things belong in a museum somewhere. They meet up with a Kong Jr., I guess you could call him, Son of Kong, and he's not nearly as big as King Kong. King Kong is probably 60 feet tall, and Junior Kong is maybe 15 feet tall, and it's more of a fairy tale than the original King Kong. It's a lower budget film that they really rushed into theaters, but it's really a good film. It's beloved by fans, even people who hold King Kong 1933 in high esteem still love Son of Kong. It's got the animation by Willis O'Brien, and it's a nice film.
Yeah.
Have you seen that one, Matt?
Yes, I have, and I enjoy it quite a bit. I thought it was very good. I know some of the attempts at humor with the Son of Kong is it's a bit much here and there, but I thought it was great, and kind of the ending always kind of stuck with me. That even when I was a kid, seeing it as just like how he saves them from like the island sinking and stuff like that.
Right, and his hand is sticking out of the water. Yeah, it's really sad. I mean, it was geared towards kids, and I'm sure children probably cried at the theater when they saw that movie in 1933.
Yeah.
I haven't watched that in quite a while. I think I've watched all of these. I watch all of these. I haven't watched Son of Kong in a while. I'm going to put that on tonight. You've inspired me. All right, then we go down to, I think number 5 on the list is going to be King Kong versus Godzilla. I mentioned that Godzilla, I think it was the 4th Godzilla movie made, maybe it was 1962. The first one was 54. King Kong versus Godzilla was the first color Godzilla film. And Willis O'Brien, who had animated King Kong in 1933, had come up with an idea and had drawn some pre-production sketches for an idea he had called King Kong versus Frankenstein. And you can see those sketches. There's a great documentary by Frank Dietz called, it's about King Kong. I can't think of the name of it. I'll think of it.
Long Live the King?
Maybe that's it. Yeah.
Is that
it? And it's an excellent documentary. It covers some of these films that I'm talking about too. But he showed some of these pre-production sketches that Willis O'Brien had done with King Kong versus Frankenstein. So you've got King Kong battling, sort of this huge creature assembled from parts of giant animals. That was O'Brien's idea, but nobody was interested in doing that. So that sort of sat on the shelf until Toho Studios in Japan sort of dusted it off and decided to make King Kong versus Godzilla. And this would have been the first time that King Kong was played by a Japanese guy and a Japanese stuntman in a shabby suit, and it is kind of a shabby suit. He's got like these long arms in some scenes that are shorter in others, and he picks up Godzilla by his tail and swings him around, flips him through the air, and that's a good scene though. I mean, it's always a fan favorite. Yeah,
he like jams a tree into Godzilla's mouth.
Yeah,
that's pretty out there.
They're like it's like they're wrestling, which really a lot of the subsequent Godzilla movies played like that. They would just have these long wrestling matches between Godzilla and monster he was versus. But that was kind of one of the first ones to do that. It's a lot of fun. That's another one that I've shown on 16 millimeter at my monthly show here at the Way Out Club here in St. Louis. I have access to a print of that. It's a lot of fun. There's also some stop motion animation in the film, but there's a scene on Skull Island where Kong is battling a giant octopus, and there's some stop motion within that sequence, which is always interesting. It's always interesting to see stop motion in these Toho giant monster movies, and it's like Godzilla versus the Thing, or also known as Godzilla versus Mothra. You see quite a bit of stop motion with Mothra's arms. Mothra's little moth arms are made with stop motion animation. A lot of people just think they just put men in suits, which was most of it, but there's a bit of it, and there's some of it in King Kong versus Godzilla. I met the guy who played I can't think of his name. He died a year ago, or about 2 years ago. I met the guy who played the original Godzilla.
Oh wow!
And I met him at a G Fest up in Chicago, and he played in the Godzilla suit from 1954 until about 1973 or 72. In the first movie he didn't play in the suit was Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, and which is one of my favorites. And I have the original Smog Monster poster. So he was there, and then the guy who kind of took over for him was also at this convention. So I got them both to sign the Godzilla versus the Smog Monster poster, because one of them played Godzilla and one of them played the Smog Monster.
Oh, that's neat.
But yeah, King Kong versus Godzilla is one of the best. Now at this point, I'm looking at my list. At this point, I would probably put in Kong Skull Island, which was made a couple of years ago. I think that's a terrific film with John Goodman and Samuel Jackson and Brie Larson. I'm not sure who directed it, but it doesn't matter. It's really terrific special effects. I think it was Oscar nominated for its special effects, and really an exciting movie and gruesome. There's some tributes to King Kong, like the giant spiders. You know, I talked at Archon about the spider sequence that was supposedly filmed for 1933's King Kong. There's been some dispute about whether that scene was actually ever filmed or not, and I talked about that. But there's a giant spider in Kong Skull Island. And then there was these weird monsters that they just sort of made up for the movie that were kind of the main protagonists. I can't remember what they called them. Skull-like or something. I don't know. But I really like Kong Skull Island. So that needs to be about number 4 on my list of giant ape movies, which brings us to number 3, and that's Peter Jackson's 2005 remake of King Kong. Have you seen that, Matt?
Yeah, I have. I have. I thought it was quite good. My biggest critique would be, I would think every scene should be like cut down by about 3 minutes. Yeah. Excuse me. I think it does run over like 2 hours and 45 minutes or something. Yeah, you're probably right. And some of the special effects haven't really held up. I just watched it on digital or high def recently. And boy, there's one sequence with brontosauruses. It just looks terrible. I'm surprised how the special effects in that one have aged already in just 14 years. Wow. But I think it's a really good movie. It's let's see, Naomi Watts played Ann Darrow. Yeah. Naomi Watts would have been about 15 years older than Fay Wray was when she played Ann Darrow in 1933. Jack Black is Carl Denham. Now, of course, in 1933, when Kong falls off the Empire State Building, Carl Denham says, "Oh, it was beauty killed the beast." And I always cringe when I hear Jack Black say that line. But Peter Jackson, who directed it, he wanted Fay Wray to be an old woman who was standing there because she was still alive when he was making this film, and he wanted her to walk up and say that line, which I think would have been a terrific tribute. But her health sort of was on the decline around that time, and she passed away. I think she passed away right about the time that movie came out. It would have been neat if she had played that. Ray Harryhausen spoke at Webster University here, and
he spoke, and I went and saw him. It was right after this King Kong 2005 remake came out, and of course Harryhausen, that's the movie that inspired him and really steered his entire career. And he liked the remake of King Kong, but the 2005 version. I don't think he cared for the 76 version, but he liked it too. Really terrific film, and I don't think it did as well as people expected it to, though.
Yeah.
Which was too bad, but I mean, it did. I think it did respectfully. Especially on the globally, I'm sure it made some money, but it wasn't the big. I think people were expecting it to be, because Peter Jackson had just come off Lord of the Rings, so there was a lot of high hopes for Mr. Jackson there.
Yeah, well, I know. Well, on my podcast, my first episode, I interviewed John Walsh, who was a trustee of the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation, and he told the story that that Dino De Laurentiis in like 1975 contacted Ray Harryhausen and wanted him to do stop motion for the movie, and that Harryhausen was on board, and he just asked him, he was like, okay, well, what's your timetable to theaters? And Dino De Laurentiis said 12 months. And Ray Harryhausen said, well, I can't do it. I need 3 years.
Yeah, I believe that. Harryhausen didn't really like to work with people. He liked to do everything himself. Really, it wasn't until Clash of the Titans, his last film, that he even had assistants.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a really remarkable animator and sculptor and just overall artist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I mean, now, nowadays, when you're watching a movie and you're looking through the credits go on, and there's just an army of people listed doing credits. But if you watch something like, Jason and the Argonauts, which is my favorite Harryhausen movie, there's just Harryhausen. Yeah. It's a little hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, that he did the work of like 100 people or 200 people. It's just amazing.
Yeah. And like the skeleton battle scene at the end of Jason and the Argonauts, he's has 7 skeletons, and they're all moving at the same time. So he's got to move, skeleton number 1's right arm up, and skeleton number 3's right arm back in the same shot, and then click off 2 frames, and then do it all over. And somebody asked him once, how did you keep that organized? How did you not accidentally, pull the one skeleton's arm the wrong way? How did you organize that? And he goes, I have no idea. It was just all in his head.
Yeah.
Just amazing guy. But I have a lot of movie memorabilia signed by Harryhausen. He would never. He was at several conventions I went to, and he would never charge for his autograph, which is a lot different than these guys today.
Yeah.
All right, this brings us to number 2, and that would be Mighty Joe Young. Yeah, 1949. That's the real sequel to King Kong, and the animation in Mighty Joe Young was credited to Willis O'Brien, but this was Ray Harryhausen's really his turn to shine. Ray Harryhausen did about 75 to 80% of the animation in Mighty Joe Young, and it's much more sophisticated than King Kong. Harryhausen was moving the camera and the monsters at the same time, so that it was much more dynamic. And it's smoother than King Kong. It's not as good a film as King Kong, but it's really great, and it stars a very young Terry Moore, who had been married to Howard Hughes, I guess right around that time, and she's still with us, Terry Moore. In fact, wasn't she in? I think she was in the remake of King Kong, of Mighty Joe Young. There was a remake of Mighty Joe. Charlize Theron. 15 years ago, maybe. I think it was before.
I think it's more than that. I think it was the 90s. I think.
Maybe this. But there's a scene where this old couple walks up, and it's Harryhausen, and on his arm is Terry Moore.
Yeah.
Kind of a nice little tribute there.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that remake of Mighty Joe Young in many years, probably since it was new. I'm not sure how well it would hold up. I have a feeling it's all CGI. I have a feeling the CGI probably doesn't hold up very well.
Yeah.
But who knows? It did win the Oscar for Best Special Effects, and I'm sure Willis O'Brien went up and received the Oscar, even though his protege Harryhausen had done more of the effects. But I don't think Harryhausen minded. I think Harryhausen would eventually get his own honorary Oscar that Tom Hanks presented to him, I think around '99, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
It didn't do as well originally at the box office as they had hoped.
Mm-hmm.
They were going to make a sequel called Mighty Joe Meets Tarzan, but they're scrapping that. Well, that would have been something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's about it, Matt. And of course, except number one.
Well, I was just gonna say about Mighty Joe Young. I remember seeing Mighty Joe Young when I was very young. Seeing it on TV, and I was blown away by it. It was just absolutely. I mean, Joe. You're looking at this model, and he's giving a performance that is alive. He is just giving this live performance. And I think I mentioned it in the interview I did with John Walsh. I just have this very vivid memory. I was probably only like 6 or 7, just of the lions jumping on Joe's back. And it is just some amazing, it's just amazing to think that those were models and that was just an animation, and how they combine some of this, the live action with the animation in Mighty Joe Young is fantastic.
It is. And then the shot of the lions on his back was on the poster.
Yeah.
And then there's also the great scene where there's the circus strongmen. There's like a dozen of these muscle-bound strongmen, and they do this tug of war, and it's just a simple scene, but it's so funny.
Yeah.
And it's so well done. Yeah. So,
yeah.
Mighty Joe Young, those movies I can never get tired of. And of course I can never get tired of King Kong. If somebody asks me what movie I've seen more times than any other movie, I always say King Kong. Because when I was a kid, I think I mentioned this at Archon, but when I was a kid, I would go to the Kirkwood Library near where I lived, and they had it on Super 8 film. This was in the mid 70s. Or maybe even early 70s. I was born in 61. So when I was like 11 and 12 years old, I would ride my bike to the Kirkwood Library, and I would check out this Super 8 film of King Kong. Now, the Super 8 film had a magnetic sound stripe on it, but I didn't even have a sound projector. I would just go home and I would watch it over and over and over again, but I would always skip reel 1 because there wasn't any action in reel 1. I would just watch reels 2 through 5 over and over and over again when I was a kid, and then and then of course it ran on the local TV station, so I'd watch it there as well. Around 70, I want to say mid 70s, they restored it, because when it first came out in 33, that was before the production codes were cracking down on things like excessive violence and even sexuality, which there is some of in King Kong. There's a scene where King Kong like pokes at Ham Darrow and then sniffs his finger. Well, that was cut out. There's some scenes where King Kong is just chomping on these natives, and there's these close-ups of these natives in Kong's teeth, and then there's some other shots of Kong stomping on some natives and some people. And I'd seen the movie so many times that by the time I saw it, it was startling for me to see the restored version. I remember seeing it for the first time in college at a 16 millimeter screening, and I was just kind of blown away by those shots. Even the scene where he kind of reaches in and grabs the wrong woman from a building, and then he kind of looks at her and realizes it's not Anne, so he just chucks her down to the ground and she falls screaming. That scene was cut out too. And in that Super 8 film that I'd watched over and over, those scenes were all cut out. So it was really neat seeing that restored print when I finally did.
Yeah.
Now, I love King Kong. It's one of my favorite movies.
Yeah. Now, I think they say that King Kong is, like, in terms of filmmakers, it is like the most possibly influential film ever made, because out comes from, from seeing King Kong. We have Ray Harryhausen, but many others who cite King Kong as an influence for them to becoming filmmakers. And then, of course, Harryhausen himself becomes an influence, to other generations of filmmakers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And first time I met Harryhausen was probably 25 years ago in Louisville, Kentucky at Wonderfest. And the organizers of Wonderfest, it was a big score to get Harryhausen.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked Harryhausen which of his films they wanted to show, because there was a movie theater, a classic movie theater near where the convention was. And they rented out, they were going to rent a 35mm print of a Harryhausen movie. They said, Ray, which of your movies do you want us to show? And he goes, I don't want you to show any of my movies. I want you guys to show King Kong. So we had a screening. I was there. I was sitting right behind Ray Harryhausen, and he got up and talked, for a long time about King Kong and how he was 12, I think, when it came out, and how he, it was his favorite movie, and et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of neat watching him introduce King Kong. He also does a commentary on the King Kong DVD. I don't want to put down Harryhausen. It's not a great commentary. It's not filled with as many historical tidbits as you might want. I always wish they would come out with another commentary by another film historian on King Kong. You can tell he's having fun watching it again, but he doesn't contribute quite as much as you might have hoped. And also the score for King Kong by Max Steiner. That was really the first time there was a score with themes for specific characters, and a score that went just from beginning to end. The score was very influential on a lot of movies too. Mm-hmm. King Kong. A lot of early, like if you watch Dracula or Frankenstein, there's a little music during the opening credits, and then there's no more music, or maybe there'll be a little bit, but it doesn't really relate to anything. Mm-hmm. So that's another way that King Kong was so far ahead of its time.
Yeah. I mean, just why do you think it had such an impact on people?
Well, I think part of it might have had to do with when it came out. I mean, 1933, that was like right in the middle of the Depression. And it it made so much money because, even though people couldn't afford to do anything, people were going to the movies. Movies was like candy. It was like cheap entertainment. So people could afford to go to the movies, but they couldn't afford to do much else. So I think it was just escapism. Its timing was perfect. That's one reason. And it's just a fantastic movie in every respect. I mean, it's paced beautifully. It's exciting. It never lets up. Once they get to Skull Island, I should say, it never lets up. Fay Wray is certainly an appealing and charismatic young actress, and she has a great scream. And every element is just incredible. And still, like even the special effects seem a little jerky today. And in Kong's fur is constantly moving because Willis O'Brien was moving it, and it was hard for him to not move the fur. So it has this weird texture going on, but I think that just sort of adds to its overall ambiance. Mm-hmm. But I could never get tired of watching King Kong. And that's another thing I mentioned, the spider sequence, the lost spider sequence. Supposedly there was a sequence where when King Kong shakes the sailors into the ravine from the tree, there's spiders and giant spiders and bugs down there that eat some of the sailors. And I don't know, there's some people argue that scene was never shot. There's only one still that survives, which I'm sure you've seen, of the giant spider. Mm-hmm. People who argue that it was never filmed say, well, if it had been filmed, there would be more stills, and that was more likely just a test shot and something that they abandoned. But then there's other people that swear that it was shot. And there's a King Kong authority. I can't think of his name, but he is interviewed in that Long Live the King documentary. And I actually saw him at a screening of that documentary, and I asked him if he thought it was filmed. He's confident that it was filmed, and it's just lost footage, probably the most famous lost footage of a favorite film there is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if somebody is listening to this has never seen King Kong, what would you tell them to do?
I should go see it, I guess. I don't know. It's not a hard movie to find. I think you could probably stream it somewhere if you have a Roku, or go to your local library. And but you should, they should probably. It's out on Blu-ray now, so there's a nice high def transfer. I saw it on scratchy, faded 8mm film for the first time, and I'm sure the prints that my local TV station ran when I was a kid probably weren't very good. Mm-hmm. So that's one of these movies. It's just gotten better in every way since I've seen it. A friend of mine collects 16mm prints, and his favorite movie was King Kong. He actually passed away last year, but he upgraded his print 5 times. He was a doctor and could afford it. But every time he would find a print that was in better shape than the print he had, he would get rid of his print and buy a new print that was in better shape. So finally, and at the end of his life, he had this gorgeous 16mm print. It had all the restored footage in it, and I watched it over at his house with him a couple of times. Mm-hmm. So if you have a chance to see it on a big screen, I don't know, I guess if you live in a big city. We showed it here as part of the St. Louis International Film Festival about 4 years ago, and the reason we did was because the Long Live the King documentary had just come out. And mm-hmm. I knew Fred Eats from Wonderfest and various things, and I have some pull with the St. Louis International Film Festival. I'm an associate with them, and I host something every year. So I hosted that double feature. And a lot of people had never seen it on the big screen. We showed it on the big screen. So if you ever get the opportunity to see it on a big screen, you should. But it's easier said than done sometimes.
Okay. Well, Tom, I had a lot of fun with this conversation today. King Kong is really just one of a kind of movie. And then I just had a really fun time talking with all of the other kind of movies, ripoffs, and ones that were kind of inspired by it. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, it was fun.
Well, there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion of giant ape movies with Tom. In the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, I have provided links to those movies as well as Tom's website, wearemoviegeeks.com. Now, if you want free stuff, you're going to want to head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get 10 free dungeon maps plus some other RPG resources that you can use in your campaigns. And as a bonus, you will never miss an episode of this show. Now, if you like these interviews, if you enjoy listening to the dicegeeks.com tabletop RPG show, then please head over to Patreon/dicegeeks and please consider giving the show some support. Every bit of support that I get on Patreon just lets me know that people want me to continue this show. I thank you for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.